Good morning, everybody. Well, we're 2 days away from what is billed to be the biggest vote in Parliament in decades. Some would speculate the most important vote since May 1940, which led to the downfall of Chamberlain and Winston Churchill coming in. Rumours this morning in some of the newspapers that the government may pull this vote. They may not allow it to go ahead because they realise the sheer level by which they're going to lose, and some people think it could be well over 100 against the government on this vote. I have to say, I would have thought if they pulled the vote at this stage, they'd look pretty stupid. Mind you, a poll in the Sunday Times finds that 48% of people right now thinks politics in Britain is broken, and only 1 in 7 voters feel that the Labour and Conservative parties now genuinely represent them. And I think to have built us up to this vote, to march us up to the top of the hill and then march us down again, I think would do yet more damage in terms of trust and faith in this Prime Minister, in government and in politics in general. What I do know for certain is that this Thursday in Brussels there is going to be a European Union summit, and assuming that Mrs May has not got her withdrawal agreement through, she's going to be going and asking for concessions. Some say it's rather like the modern-day equivalent of Margaret Thatcher in 1984 with her handbag. Would the EU give concessions, and crucially, would they come on the backstop, the Irish backstop? So I'm asking you this morning, what do you want to happen on Tuesday, assuming this vote goes ahead? Or maybe you think it's a good idea to pull the vote. And if you want the PM's deal to go through, if you think this actually gets us Brexit and you're happy with it and you believe this deal honours the vote, call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think actually it's time she went and maybe Labour took over and motion of confidence, remove the government. And if that's how you feel, if you really believe that Corbyn would do a better job, text to 84850. Or maybe you want a second referendum, or perhaps you'd rather we left on a WTO deal. Tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC, and of course Facebookers, you can comment there too. What do I want? Well, I want to see this appalling deal, the worst deal in history. I want to see it rejected. I want to see this Prime Minister gone. I think she has been utterly duplicitous with us all the way through, telling us that with the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration, we'll be free to strike trade deals, we'll be controlling our borders, all things that frankly have not been in any way agreed at this moment in time. I want to see a proper Brexit leader in charge of the Conservative Party, because I'm absolutely certain that the public would get behind them in an extraordinary way. And yes, of course, I want us to leave at 11 p.m. on the 29th of March 2019, and I'm perfectly happy for that to happen on a negotiated World Trade Organization exit. And isn't it funny, whenever this WTO option, this no-deal option gets discussed, all we hear are a group of politicians, none of whom have ever worked in business, telling us it's a cliff edge, it'll be catastrophic, disaster for the UK economy. As I say, none of them with any experience of this at all. And what we're going to do today at 10:30 is I'm going to get an expert in, Shankar Singham from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we will talk about WTO. We'll talk about the upsides. We'll talk too about the downsides, and you'll get a chance to come on and question him too. There's been too little debate about this option, and we need to talk about it because, you know, it's rumoured that Jeremy Hunt is one of those perhaps lining up to perhaps take over from Theresa May if the chance arrives. And it seems he is coming round to the view that maybe this is the best thing that we can do. So what do you want to see happen on Tuesday? Bert in Macclesfield is a new caller. Good morning, Bert.
Yes, hi Nigel. Great to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. So what would you like to see happen on Tuesday in Parliament?
The deal needs to be voted down, and the Tories need to get Theresa May out as fast as possible, because clearly the lady is incompetent. She can't negotiate. Everything that she could have done wrong, she has done wrong. And I find it incredible, absolutely incredible, that when you speak to any Tory person at the moment, they say that, well, if the deal goes down, we'll have to send her back to negotiate. What? We're going to send this woman back? I mean, it's just appalling that, I mean, I vote Tory, right? I'll put my cards on the table.
Yep.
I am a natural Tory voter. But I find it incredibly disappointing that the Tory party cannot find 15% of members, just 48 members of Parliament, who recognise that this woman has to go.
Well, what they say, Bert, they say the deal's dreadful, the deal's awful, but we support the Prime Minister. And yet it's this Prime Minister that's negotiated it. And I find it incredible when Boris says that and David Davis says that. They want...
It is. They need to be conviction politicians, a bit like Margaret Thatcher, a bit like Tony Blair.
Yeah, I agree with you.
They need to say what they feel.
I agree with you.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a place at times, Nigel, for loyalty, to support the leader, to play for the team and all that. But time and time and time again, this woman has failed and failed and failed.
Yeah.
She used to say, no deal is better than a bad deal.
She never meant it. She never meant it, Bert.
She's changed it to a deal that's acceptable to very few is better than no deal.
She has. But when you hear her say, we're taking back control of our laws, our money and our borders, how do you react?
Well, the people didn't vote to take back control of those things. The people voted to leave the EU, basically.
Which would mean taking back control of those things, wouldn't it? But when you hear her say it, does it sound sincere to you?
No, she's not a natural leader, and she just has to go. It's as simple as that,
but well, I tell you what, you couldn't be simpler. I get by text, Nigel, I want on Tuesday night 48 letters to go in because Mrs May has to go. Get rid of the backstop and the deluded 39 billion just for a conversation. Paul in Cornwall knows what he thinks. Come on, someone out there must think this deal is good. 0345 6060 973. I'm going to Burgess Hill to speak to John, a new caller. Good morning, John.
Hello, Nigel. First of all, can I say I'm just a great fan of yours, as millions are. All right, I've sorted the problem out. I know.
Oh, right, okay.
I've sorted it all out, mate. How this deal could be great for Britain.
Okay.
And how this deal could be great for Britain would be if everybody, if the vote went the other way.
Right.
So if we'd all voted to remain, then this deal would have been a great deal because all the people like me, I would have probably thought, well, we voted, I respect the result, but I lost. But hey, look, they've given us some compromises. I mean, can you imagine if there was a general election, Nigel, and say the Conservatives win the general election, but they haven't got a massive majority, but they won by quite a bit. Can you imagine saying, "Oh well, hang on a minute, UKIP got 4 million votes. I'll tell you what, let's give them use a couple of their policies because it would never happen."
Do you think,
ever do it.
John, was there an argument right from the referendum itself that what should have done is actually a government of national unity should have been formed, picking talents from across the spectrum to get Brexit done?
Yep, and I think you should have led it.
Well, I wasn't going to lead it because I wouldn't be that popular in Westminster, but I'd love to, John, I'd love to have helped and no one wanted me. John, thank you. Have a great day. Margaret says on Facebook, walk away and let the EU come back to us. And Margaret, I am as certain as I can be about anything, that if we announce we're leaving on World Trade Organization rules, they will come running down the street after us because the German car industry will demand that they're able to sell their cars into this country without 10% tariff. I'm absolutely certain. Grant says, I want to see politicians deliver what the people have voted for. Otherwise, the Conservatives will lose my vote forever. Grant, there are millions of people saying that, and quite a few Labour ones as well. Chris says, May is the very last politician we should send to Brussels. In fact, we don't need to go back to Brussels. We can tell the EU we're leaving on March the 29th with a no-deal WTO Brexit. And amongst leavers, that point of view is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. We've had enough as leavers of simply being mucked about. I'm going to Heathrow to speak to Matthew, a regular caller. Good morning, Matthew.
Morning, Nigel. Basically, I mean, I think Theresa May, I mean, I want her to win the vote, and I think she's going to pull it off. I mean, what she's going to do is, she's going to give an olive branch to the other parties and give them some concessions because she knows we've got to get this through so we could get to the next stage about the trade talks. I mean, otherwise we're not going to get nowhere.
But aren't the trade talks, Matthew, and I know you study this very carefully, but aren't the trade talks almost irrelevant because the EU could just say no, 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 and then trigger the backstop?
Well, I mean, we've got to work with them, and I mean, at the moment, the deal she's proposing is, I mean, all options are on the table. Either we stay aligned, or basically we dump Northern Ireland, we dump the DUP, and because I mean, WTO would only work if Northern Ireland is a part. Otherwise, we can't have a land border with the EU.
But I mean, this hard border, Matthew, this hard border, I mean, it's a hoax, isn't it? We're not going to build a hard border. The Taoiseach has said, whatever the circumstances, he's not going to build a hard border. I keep asking Mr. Barnier, whenever I see him, whether he's going to build a hard border, and he isn't. I mean, isn't this all a bit of a nonsense? Hasn't the Prime Minister been conned into signing up to this backstop when, frankly, there's no real reason?
Well, no, I mean, I believe, I mean, we've got to, I mean, the reason people voted for Brexit, the one reason was because of the immigration. Theresa May is giving what the people want in control of immigration.
How?
And, well, basically, she's stopping free movement.
How?
But there is going to be a border in the North Sea, because otherwise people could just go to Ireland, hop over to Northern Ireland, and come over to the mainland.
Well, Ireland's not in Schengen, thank God. But as far as free movement, Matthew, she keeps saying that free movement's going to end, and yet when I read and look through the political declaration, whilst it acknowledges that the UK wants to end free movement, the language there is, we will agree to discuss these things. None of it's guaranteed. We've given away 39 billion, Matthew. We have signed up to something legally that does actually make us effectively, I mean, Northern Ireland could be annexed. I don't think it's good enough. Matthew, thank you very much indeed for your call. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 10:15. Cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right of them, into the Valley of Death rode the 600. Yes, some might remember that as the charge of the Light Brigade. And I've been thinking this morning, this is a bit like the charge of a Light Brigade, and several commentators take the same view. Will Theresa May, will she lead the 600 into knowing that she's going to lose this parliamentary vote and probably lose it very heavily? Yet another junior ministerial resignation overnight, and even talk that perhaps another cabinet minister could go between now and Tuesday evening. Lots of speculation about Penny Mordaunt. Is she going to do it? Is she not going to do it? Either way, what we do know is she's going to be in Brussels on Thursday evening. But assuming that vote goes ahead, what do you want to see happen? And on Twitter I would just like to see democracy. So would I. But what's been happening ever since that referendum is we have seen our political class just refusing to accept the vote of the British people. They keep telling us we didn't know what we voted for. We didn't vote to make ourselves poorer. I mean, all this stuff they keep endlessly coming out with. And they even have the gall at times to say they respect the vote. Parliament doesn't respect the vote. It needs to be fearful of the voters if we're going to get a decent Brexit. Fran is calling from Kingswood. Good morning, Fran.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I'm all right. I mean, like everybody else, Fran. Like everybody else, Fran. I speculate as to what I think is going to happen, but let's be frank. None of us really have a clue, do we?
We don't. And my reason for calling, I hadn't actually seen this before, but I mean, the choices clearly are leave with nothing or the deal that's been agreed. But what I found very interesting, I cannot remember her name, but I saw an interview with one of the ladies who is head of the sort of Norway, Liechtenstein, Iceland
the EFTA group,
union,
yeah.
And her thoughts were, we don't particularly, it's all very well for the UK to say, when we leave, we will organise our own trade agreements, you know, we'll be out in the big world, we'll be playing with the big boys, and we can do this, and this. But her consensus generally was, you will upset the apple cart. We don't really want you. And
I did see that.
They have free movement. They have, you know, there were 4 red lines that she said, my understanding of what people voted out of Europe for, we have those red lines in place. So it won't be part of our group. We trade more with Ireland than we do with China. So the whole let's go into the big wide world, I don't think, and I'm not saying that people are, you know, it was stupid because they voted one way or the other. Democracy is vote, you know, however you voted with head, heart, or whatever, your vote counts as everybody else's vote counts. So I don't dismiss that people voted, but I'm also wondering what people do, whether their expectations are, we will be welcomed into the trade world. And
around the world, Fran, yes.
So the unknown.
Around the world, Fran, yes, absolutely. I mean, a lot of countries saying, come on, UK, get Brexit sorted. We want to sit down and talk with you. Of that, there's no doubt. As far as EFTA's concerned, and that group of very small, great countries, but small countries, I think, we would just dwarf them, I think, and that's perhaps their concern. But what is coming through, Fran, is quite a consensus for a Norway-style deal. And that, of course, is something that Amber Rudd is talking about. It's something that Stephen Kinnock is talking about. And that, of course, would leave us inside single market and their rules. It would leave us with free movement of people. And I suspect, unlike Norway, which have got their fish, this would probably be Norway minus, because we wouldn't actually get the fish anyway. Fran, it seems to me that whatever the economic debate is, given how little time we've got, isn't perhaps the only way we can genuinely deliver on the Brexit vote is to go for a WTO negotiated exit.
And as I said to your lovely research guy, I just don't want to see a change of government next week. I don't think that they're in any way brilliant, but I just don't think that at the moment we will be going into any world trade agreements strong when we can't show that our own country can't pull together. But equally, I look at the telly and I see France and Paris, and everywhere and everybody is in meltdown. It's a very funny world at the moment. So,
what it is. I mean, this feeling of disconnection, Fran, that ordinary folks have from the political elites living in the big cities. And in a sense, you could argue that's been one of the main driving forces of Brexit, Trump, the Italian government, and indeed what's going on in Paris at the moment. Fran, just very quickly, do you think Tory MPs should be loyal to Theresa May to keep her as Prime Minister?
No, I think that Tory MPs are being loyal to their own position that they still want to be the ruling party. I don't think they're being loyal particularly to Theresa May. I think they're just thinking we have more of a chance of getting up the ladder being in than being out. So I think that's
all right. You're very cynical, Fran. You're very cynical about career politicians, but you're probably right. Fran, I'm going to let you go and move to Aberdeen. Speak to James, who's a new caller to the show. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. So, what do you want to see happen, James?
Well, I voted Leave in June 2016, and I see from the morning of that vote, there's been a conspiracy between the civil service in this country and the political classes to make sure that we didn't get our way. It's as simple as that. There's too much money at stake. There's too many vested interests in this country. But speaking about a people's vote, we've already had a vote. If they go down that line, then that's me finished with voting forever. I've voted since I was 18-year-old. I voted Labour, and I recently started voting Conservatives. But that's the end of it for me. End of story. And there's plenty of people who I speak to have got exactly the same view. I want to see it voted down. I want to see what you say. Go to Europe and say, here you go. That's what's going to happen. If you don't like it, that's it. End of story.
The trouble is, James, the trouble is...
You should have said that from the word go.
There are lots of... And by the way, I agree very heavily with your analysis of what's happened since the 24th of June 2016. But isn't the problem? There are so many people, James, like you, and I meet them. That's it. Stuff it. I'm never going to vote again. What's the point? They don't listen. It's all dishonest. But the more people, James, like you, that give up on voting, the more the establishment wins.
Yeah, that's right. But if there is another, what they call... a people's vote. What a stupid thing to say. A people's vote. We all know what they want. They want the vote rerun, and in this time the Remain. I mean, we're speaking about Macron. He's already threatened the Scottish fishermen and the British fishermen.
I know.
If he doesn't get access and they scoop the seas dry, if we let them in, there'll be no fish for anybody.
Well, actually, in terms of whitefish, there isn't much for Scotland anyway. It's been a disaster. James, I thank you for your call. Nigel, I blame Cameron for not having a plan if we'd voted Brexit. He just walked away and left it for someone else to sort out an impossible task. It's not May's fault, says Keith in Chingford. I saw David Cameron on Friday. We were actually quite civil with each other. Look, Keith, it was clearly difficult when Mrs. May took over. No question about that, which is perhaps why it took 9 months to trigger Article 50 rather than it being done very quickly after the referendum. But, you know, she's now had an awfully long time, and the fatal error was when she left Downing Street at 4:15 in the morning to go and meet a deadline set by an unelected bureaucrat called Barnier in Brussels, and she signed up to the backstop. And ever since then, it has been a very real problem. Craig on Facebook says there's no such thing as no deal. It's called WTO rules. But in a few moments, Craig, we're going to debate that, and you're going to get a chance, folks, to ring in and ask questions about what WTO terms mean. Meanwhile, I'm off to Gillian in the southwest of France. Good morning, Gillian. Hello, Gillian. No, let's go to John in Loughton instead. I can't get Gillian. John, good morning.
Yeah, hello there, Nigel. Look, I've got a question for you, if you don't mind.
Well, I tell you what, how about you answer my one, and you tell me what you'd like to see happen on Tuesday?
Okay, well, I'd like there not to be the vote, because, as you say, it's the charge of the Light Brigade. There's no point having it.
Right.
And I think Theresa May should resign.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they should have a rapid leadership election.
Yep.
And I think they should appoint a vote-in through the members, because the members will probably vote for Boris Johnson, and I think he should be the next Prime Minister. I think he should create a sort of Brexit-centric cabinet, cross-party, and I think that he should also invite you to be his Brexit minister.
Right.
Would you do that if he did that?
John, if there was a Prime Minister who believed in Brexit and wanted to put together a Brexit cabinet and took Brexit more seriously than just the Conservative Party, and wanted to get people in from across the spectrum to help, all of whom had a common goal of making this work, I'd be more than happy to do anything to help, and I've said that, John, every day since that referendum.
Well, in which case, that's what I hope for.
Right, OK, John, couldn't be clearer. John in Loughton, thank you very much indeed. Not sure that it's going to happen. Just my frustration with all of this and hearing, oh, well, you know, maybe they'll get the 48 letters and that's going to happen on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. This should all have happened back in July. It was clear, folks, from the Chequers deal being revealed, it was clear she was selling out Brexit, that at best it'd be Brexit in name only, and at worst it'd be what we've now got, which is the worst deal in history. The Tory party have been too gutless. They should have got rid of her 5 months ago. We'd be in a much better position if they had. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's now 10:30 and time for the news with Philip Christakos. Good morning. Well, the option of the World Trade Organization gets hardly any debate whatsoever, apart from, of course, being told by people in Parliament, most of whom have never bought and sold a good in their lives, that we'd be falling off the edge of a cliff. It would be a catastrophe. And yet, a significant number, big majority now of Leave voters want this WTO option. But let's find out. Let's actually start at the beginning. Let's find out what this really means. And joining me to help you, is Shankar Singham, Director of International Trade and Competition at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Shankar, good morning and welcome to LBC. Let's start at the beginning. Yeah. What is the World Trade Organization?
Well, so the World Trade Organization is not some sort of faceless bureaucracy. It is actually just a group of member countries, which is basically most of the world, almost all of the world. And these members essentially agree the terms of trade between them, and they have been negotiating reductions in trade barriers between them since 1947, and they have very successfully lowered things like the industrial goods tariff, which is down to about 2 or 3% on an average basis. In 1947, that was much higher. So the WTO exists of members that the purpose of it is to lower trade barriers, increase trade facilitation, make trade flow better between the different countries, and it has started off just talking about industrial goods. It's now covering things like services. It covers intellectual property. It covers a whole range of trade-related areas. And the whole purpose of it is to make trade flow more easily.
And how much of global trade is done on the basis of WTO rules?
Well, there's a lot of trade that is done under WTO rules and under the multilateral system. Now, of course, what's happened is because the multilateral system has not been able to deliver progressive liberalisation in the last 20 years, you've seen this increase in free trade agreements between countries. But this was not the norm. For the bulk of the history of the WTO, of the GATT, its predecessor, and the WTO, countries didn't have free trade agreements. It was considered to be a bad thing to have discriminatory arrangements that discriminated against other WTO members. And in fact, there are WTO rules that tell you when a free trade agreement is legal and when it's not legal. And broadly speaking, it's got to be trade creative. It's got to be a stepping stone to further liberalisation at the multilateral level, at the WTO level. So that's what the WTO has been doing.
Now, we trade with China. In fact, Christmas coming up.
Yes.
I mean, virtually all of our Christmas presents that we give to children would have been manufactured in China. And we see these huge container ships. I think the biggest ones now take 20,000 containers. I mean, like a block of flats coming up the English Channel. And they're coming into Southampton, they're coming into Felixstowe. And we do that, as I understand it, on World Trade Organization rules.
Yeah, so you don't need to have a trade agreement in order to trade.
Right.
People trade all over the place. They've traded for thousands of years without any of these agreements. Now, the purpose of these agreements, including the WTO agreements, is to lower the barriers. So while we don't have a trade agreement with China, for example, we're trading under WTO terms, there are plenty of barriers in terms of our products going into China. We have fewer barriers for their products coming into us. And so we would want to have, with countries like China and with other countries, we'd want to have trade agreements with them to lower those barriers. But certainly, yes.
But as of today, because the impression that's been given is that if we leave the European Union's customs union, there'll be terrible delays because all the products will have to be checked for standards, tariffs charged. When that container ship comes into Southampton, what happens?
Yeah, so when the container comes into Southampton with China products, there are checks that are done. They are done fairly rapidly. A very small percentage of those products are actually checked because any customs authority will apply risk mitigation techniques. So you don't want to check every single container, otherwise you will never get trade flowing. So we check, typically 2, 3, 4% of the containers that come in. Also, most of the customs nowadays is done electronically anyway, and it's done pre-clearance. So a lot of these products while the ship is coming into Southampton, the customs checks are already being done. The electronic forms are being submitted already. So the way customs is going generally in the world is the border is becoming less of an inspection point and more of a tax point. So customs is becoming less and less intrusive, and we're trying to do more and more things to make customs work better. Never mind trade agreements, just generally in customs. And customs is improving, I think, in that respect.
Now, the M20, that Dover-Calais route, clearly very important. I mean, how much of our trade goes through that route?
Well, we have a significant amount of trade that currently goes through the Dover-Calais, what's called roll-on, roll-off ports. And that happens because it's obviously a very short crossing. It makes sense. And while we're members of the EU and you have equal terms with other ports, economically it's justified. But, there are many, many other ports that we use as well. Zeebrugge, other ports in Europe, where trade, if there were problems at with Dover-Calais, yes, it would be slightly more expensive, but not significantly so. And many of the port authorities in the UK are actually already in conversations with Zeebrugge and Antwerp, other ports around.
Who are probably quite hungry for the business.
Who are hungry for the business, and that's one of the reasons. Actually, it's often said that Calais, the French could basically block the Dover-Calais port, and that would be a huge the Dover-Calais route, and that would be a huge problem. But it's not in their interest to do that. And Xavier Bertrand, the head of the Calais region, basically said, "We're not going to do that because we don't want to lose this valuable business. They don't want to make the Calais region, desperately poor because they're losing trade to other ports." So he was very clear that that's not going to happen.
Can we, given the time we've got, March the 29th is upon us, we could this week face the next 2 weeks, a complete deadlock in our parliamentary system. The law that's in place at the moment means that unless that legislation is unpicked, we would be leaving on these terms in March. Is it possible in the time we've got to make this happen reasonably smoothly, or would there be a lot of disruption?
Well, so one of the things that we talked about earlier on was the fact that we tend to focus a lot on the end states and we don't focus on the process. And I would argue that one of the reasons we've got into the mess we've got into is because we haven't focused enough on the process of how we get there. So what I would say is that if this is voted down, and all indications are that it will be voted down on Tuesday, assuming there is a vote, then what the government should do is, you prepare for every eventuality, right? A no deal is a potential, or WTO terms deal is an eventuality that you prepare for. But what you also do is you recognise that the EU does not want no deal. The EU is a major agricultural exporter into our market, and if there is a no deal, we will have to do some things to control food price inflation. We'll have to perhaps apply a zero tariff for some agri-food. We might have to open up our agricultural import quotas for other countries. This would be very bad for EU agricultural exporters, and the EU agricultural sector is the most powerful lobby
if I buy
on the continent.
If I buy a French cheese, for argument's sake, in a British supermarket, how much of that would be tariff under WTO?
Well, if we go to tariffs on dairy products and on agriculture, the tariffs for those products are very high, typically 30, 40, 50%.
But we could choose not to apply it.
Well, but then we'd have to do that for the whole world.
Right.
And that's what the EU does not want to have happen. They don't want to lose market share in the UK. They've got a nice protected market in the UK right now. So what we should do is get out, aggressively on the front foot after the vote is lost and say, we want to, a lot of the withdrawal agreement is okay. The things that are not okay are fatal. We want to remove these poison pills, and they're basically the four things. The backstop, obviously, things like the statement about the single customs territory, which is very disturbing, which takes our independent trade policy off the table, and even things like geographical indications, which the EU has sort of smuggled into the withdrawal agreement when it really belongs in a trade negotiation, despite the fact that they've said that you can only do trade.
Well, look, Shankar, I've asked a few questions, but the public are very keen to ask you questions because they don't get the chance to do this. So we're going to go to Michael in Slough, a new caller of the show. Michael, ask Shankar whatever question you like, please.
Hello there.
Good morning.
I'm very old, and I remember before we joined the EEC, which is all it was then, that there was no trouble with applying World Trade Organization type rules. So why is Project Fear trying to suggest that it's going to be a disaster?
So, Michael asking, why are they saying it'll be a disaster? I'm going to just add to Michael's question. They also say we'd be a lot poorer under these rules.
Yeah. Well, we obviously have seen the Treasury projections, the Bank of England projections, etc., about the various options that are on the table. The problem with these projections is, first of all, it is incredibly difficult to predict in an economic model the impact of your independent trade and regulatory policy. I mean, countries have tried to do this. Countries have notoriously failed to do this. New Zealand, for example, estimated the benefits of the New Zealand-China free trade agreement, and they underestimated by 500%. Wow. New Zealand achieved a level of exports to China within 20 months that their modelers said they would achieve in 20 years. So the first thing I would say is be very careful about any of these projections. They're incredibly difficult to do. They also depend on your assumptions. If you're assuming that the UK will do nothing different if we have a WTO or an advanced free trade agreement, for example, with the EU, if we leave without an arrangement, if we do nothing different, then yes, there may be some negative consequences and disruptions. But we aren't going to do nothing different. We are going to change. We're going to do, for example, on medicines, we can do unilateral acceptance We can do all of these things, and that will improve our situation in that regard. I mentioned earlier on, we may, in the case of a no-deal situation, have to open up our import quotas to other countries. This will lower prices, not increase prices. This will lower prices of agriculture and food in the store, which is good for poorer consumers anyway.
So people who need their insulin, you don't see a great problem there then?
Well, actually, even the Brexit department's no-deal briefings basically said we would unilaterally accept European standards for what's called batch testing.
Okay, Michael, are you happy with those answers?
Yes, I am, and I think it's good that he's making it clear that there are any projections, and we know what government projections are like. They got it all wrong at the time of Independence Day.
Well, actually, Michael, they get everything wrong, really, don't they? Michael, thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'm here with Shankar Singham from the IEA. He's taking your calls, your queries, your fears on WTO deal as opposed to membership of the European Union. We'll be back in a moment, but for now, it's 10:46. I'm here with Shankar Singham. He's from the Institute of Economic Affairs. We're taking your questions about the World Trade Organization. What are the benefits, what are the downsides of us leaving on the basis of that on the 29th of March next year? Gary in Muswell Hill says, we are told by Remainers that Argentina could block our membership of the World Trade Organization. Is this true?
So, no. We are members of the World Trade Organization now. We are founding members of the GATT. We are members of the WTO. What we have to do is we have to place our what's called schedules, our goods, our schedule of tariffs and so forth for goods, and our services schedules and some other things we have to place before the members. Now, the news, you've heard a number of countries saying, well, we're not going to accept your schedules in certain areas, and primarily these are the agricultural exporters into the European Union who want to see more opening from the UK and frankly from the EU as we put our schedules on the table for the EU, and some of the countries have said they are going to be difficult in that respect. But one of the things that's again not picked up in the withdrawal agreement is this commitment to collaborate with the EU on the WTO side of things. Now, we are in a process of negotiation with the WTO, and we need to be able to say to countries like Argentina and others that we are willing to liberalize in the future, and the future is quite soon. If we are able to say that to them, then they will be much more reasonable with us in our WTO, what's called modification.
Okay, so you're not concerned that we could say this is what we want to do, and the club won't let us.
Well,
play our full. We're members, but play our full part.
I am concerned that we may end up in difficulty in our modification process if we continue to be tied to the EU in that modification process, because the EU does not have the ability to say to those countries, we can liberalise in the future in the products that you care about, which are mostly agricultural. If we are in the room by ourselves and we can have those conversations, and it's not just Argentina, it's the Americans, it's New Zealand, it's all of our allies, we've got to be able to have those conversations directly with them without the EU in the room.
But the withdrawal agreement would stop that from
happening. That would stop that from happening.
Of course. No, I get that. I fully understand that. Nigel, please ask your guest. Surely the issue with WTO is that it could not be in place for trade to go on from next March. We'd finish up not being able to trade with Europe, says Ian.
No, so our schedules actually are in place now with the WTO, and we have to work through these objections from certain countries. We are in a modification process where we do that. Now, my understanding is that that process is moving forward. Again, the same issue. If we're moving forward with that process and we are tied to the EU, it's a much more difficult process. If we're able to say to these countries we can open up in the future, it's in their interests to be helpful to us. I mean, the one area that's a particular issue for us right now is what's called the government procurement agreement, which sounds like a very academic, Geneva type thing, but in fact it controls the conditions of procurement, state procurement all over the world. And we need to be members of it. We do need to accede to that agreement. And if we fail to do that, if that's blocked, then all of our defence procurement with the US, which is the biggest defence procurer in the world by far, is at risk. So again, the reason the Americans blocked our accession to the GPA initially. It's moving a bit more easily now. But the reason they blocked it initially is because they thought that they read the Chequers document, they read the withdrawal agreement, and they thought we won't be able to do a trade deal with them in the future.
Yes, well, no, certainly the choice is these agreements or what we're discussing now. Catherine in Romford would like to ask a question. Good morning, Catherine.
Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. Right, far away, Catherine, please.
I would like to ask you about prices of goods, the difference between the prices of goods as members of the EU compared with world prices, because my understanding is that as members of the EU, we pay EU prices, whether goods come from other countries within the EU or whether the goods come from outside of the EU, because the EU would therefore place external tariffs on those goods. So if you could provide some information about the prices of ordinary...
No, Catherine, that's useful, because all the Remainers say if we left with no deal, everything would go up in price.
Well, one of the things that happens when you're in a customs union is your supply chains sort of orient inside the customs union, because there's a very high tariff wall outside the, on the customs union, outside the customs union. So a lot of our products come from the EU. A lot of our agricultural food products come from the EU, largely because it's very hard for people outside of the EU to export to us. So one of the things that we would be able to do in the context of a trade agreement, or indeed if we end up on WTO terms, is we would be able to lower our tariffs in negotiations with people or unilaterally for those products, and that will lower the prices of those products. Now, particularly for agricultural and food products, tariffs are very, very high. Industrial goods, they're quite low around the world, but for food products and agriculture, they are extremely high. We're talking 40, 50%. We have a special arrangement with most countries where we have a particular tariff for a certain amount of that product, and then when you go beyond that, the tariff goes very high indeed, 80, 100%. So it basically blocks the imports. So if we're able to open that up, then we will be able to lower food prices.
But equally, Shankar, if I'm a dairy farmer and I'm selling dairy products into the EU at the moment, this will be a problem for me, wouldn't it?
This will be a problem, because what will happen is you will have then the common external tariff of the EU applied to you.
Yes.
So it will make it very difficult for UK agricultural exporters to sell to the EU. They will have to find other markets if we...
No, well, that's honest and that's frank, and that's very, very important that we get the upsides and the downsides of going in this direction. George in Newark is a new caller. Good morning, George.
Good morning.
Far away, George, and Shankar will try and answer, please.
I'd like to ask about you discussing earlier the idea of negotiating trade between individual ports and places in Europe. And after Brexit, we will still do a lot of our trade with Europe. Is there a possibility that the EU and people in Europe would make it deliberately very difficult for us to do that trade?
So this is often said, and in fact I think it was said of the Calais port that they would make it difficult for us, and therefore they'd disrupt the Dover-Calais roll-on, roll-off trade, which is very important to us, but I would point out also it's very important to the French. When that statement was made, Xavier Bertrand, the head of the region, the Calais region, said, we are absolutely not going to damage Calais. We're not going to disrupt that trade, because they know that if they do, there's a possibility that trade will move elsewhere. And a lot of the British ports are in conversations with other European ports to deal with that contingency.
It's a world of change. Shankar Singham, thanks for coming in. I feel we've barely even started to talk about this subject, but we have started to talk about it, and thank you. And I hope we'll talk. And this is a theme, folks, we will come back to, because I think too much of our debate around this has just been to say it'll be a disaster and not really to talk about how it could work. Well, coming up in the course of the next hour, I'm going to go back to this debate of what do you want to see happen on Tuesday? Do you want to see Mrs. May's deal succeed? Do you want it voted down? Do you want a new Prime Minister? Because, hey, we could be talking about that within the next 48 hours or more. Also, I'm going to talk a bit about Paris, the fourth weekend of riots. Macron's rating now down to 18%. At the same time, Trump's is at 50%. That makes me laugh. And also, the United Nations, they're trying to put together a global pact on migration in Marrakesh. Over the course of the next couple of days, 100,000 of you have signed a petition wanting a parliamentary debate on this, yet the government appears to support it. Coming back in a couple of moments. Perhaps a very tumultuous week in British politics. Maybe the most important vote since 1940. Maybe the biggest constitutional crisis since about 1911. So big stuff happening. And the reason I spent the last half an hour talking about the World Trade Organization, how it operates, what the upsides and downsides are, is that I feel it's been a very neglected part of this conversation. But it's very interesting when the Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, says the chances of a no-deal Brexit are increasing by the day, as does Liam Fox. And the Governor of the Bank of England, of course, is horrified by this and says the chances of it are uncomfortably high. Frankly, I'm not fearful of change. I'm not fearful of a different way of doing things. I'm not fearful of us making these decisions rather than the European Commission. But I do understand that with change, there are winners and losers, and that frightens some people. So what do you want to see happen this week? Do you want the Prime Minister to win on Tuesday? I get on text, I would like to see no vote on her deal, and for the PM to resign, and an interim leader take over, and for the UK to leave on WTO rules. There we are. Mark's got his tick list there. Well, I frankly, to me, if those rumours we're seeing in the newspapers today are true, and she's thinking of pulling this vote, I just think that would be a further humiliation for her, for her prime ministership. And if she goes to Brussels and says, look, you know, we need a better deal, they'll say, why didn't you put it to the vote? So she actually, to get a renegotiation of any kind in Brussels, she needs to lose on Tuesday. But perhaps if she loses by 100, 120, maybe that'll be the end of her premiership anyway. I don't know. I hate this deal. It's the worst deal in history. I thought it was really interesting yesterday to see Peter Hargreaves, Jeremy Hosking and Stuart Wheeler, three people who between them gave £5 million to Believe campaign, all three of them saying the same thing. They actually felt staying in the EU was better than May's deal. Thomas in Blackpool is a new caller. Good morning, Thomas.
Good morning, Nigel. Pleasure to speak to you.
Pleasure to speak to you.
I'm a Brexiteer in favour of WTO pending the EU coming up with a real deal.
Yes.
Theresa May, in my view, must be gone by Wednesday morning by either being defeated in the vote if she's got the nerve to stage it, or if she pulls it, she'll be clearly indicating how incompetent and devious she's been over the last 18 months or so.
But isn't Thomas the problem? Just the lack of courage, you know? I mean, this morning Boris was asked, you know, do you 100% rule out standing against Theresa May? And he responds, I'm 100% about getting this right. Why will no one challenge her? Why didn't Boris challenge her, Thomas, back in July?
Yes, I agree. Yes, he should really have done that. There's absolutely no way Theresa May should go back to Brussels except in a cardboard box with second-class post on it and no return address.
That's a bit too much, Thomas. But that's a bit too much. I mean, I want to see her go as Prime Minister and enjoy her retirement out in Berkshire or Buckinghamshire. That'd be fine. Thomas, thank you. Mark in Pembrokeshire is a new caller. Good morning.
Morning, Nigel.
Good morning. So Mark, is this the best deal she could have got? She keeps telling us it's the best deal we could have got. The EU tell us it's the only deal. Are perhaps Eurosceptics fighting too hard against this? Maybe the right thing is to pass it.
No, never in years. To be quite honest, Nigel, it's quite common sense, really. If you look at the board on the open thing, like Britain trades more with the world than does with the EU, okay?
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Now, you've got the EU, they trade more with us, okay? So the argument's been won on that many times, okay? So the thing is, how can we as a country go over there and turn around and then say, like, okay, we accept all your rules. There you are, no problem. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, no. I'm letting you develop the argument, Mark.
Right. Okay. So the thing is, see, it's quite obvious we've got all the cards necessary because the thing is, they need to trade with us because the thing is, for one thing, Britain is the second highest to the whole of the EU. That props it up. You know, France should be the next one because the thing is, France wants as much as what Germany wants. And we are doing what France needs to do, but yet they're telling us what we have to do in order to stay in their membership. Well, in that way, the EU is just like sort of the middleman. Everything goes into the EU. The EU then says, okay, we'll give you tariff-free right, fine, we pay a membership to them, but they still stick a tariff on us, because the thing is, they're sticking a higher percentage on the goods coming through the EU to get to our country. So the thing is, we're paying more.
Well, that's true. No, I mean, Mark, the truth of it is, of course, we never had a free trade deal with the European Union because we paid a net £10 billion a year for the privilege. Do you, Mark, is it your view, Mark, that the Tory party need to man up, get rid of her this week and find somebody else?
Well, if the Tory party doesn't do that, then the Tory party will be absolutely and totally finished. And the Labour Party as well, because the thing is, before Corbyn, well, all his life, I don't want to be in the EU. Then he goes over.
I know.
And I truly believe this is controlled opposition, this is. All the Parliament are fighting each other about what is good for this, that, well, but for their own interest, not the interest of the people itself. And Nigel, you've been the voice of the whole country, really, since the beginning of the referendum and even before leading up to it, yes?
Well, there have been plenty of others too, Mark, but go on.
Right. Yeah, I'll just finish this one off.
Yeah, go on.
Right. You've said now about the EU building up a military unification, or whatever you want to call it, right?
Well, yes, and actually, Mark, I will talk very shortly about the fact there were Portuguese paramilitaries in the streets of Paris yesterday. But yeah, go on, Mark.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it's strongly coming through now, and it's electrifying now throughout the public as well. Everywhere, everybody's talking about it. But it's coming strongly through now that they've never been building an EU army. Each country has had their military, but now they're unifying, and Britain has signed up to it.
Yeah, no, Mark, and that's another reason why she must go. Mark, you've had a good crack. I'm down to Ramsgate to speak to Tony. Good morning, Tony. Hello, Tony. No, another one.
Hello.
Tony.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now. Right, Tony, far away.
Hello, good morning. How you doing?
Fine, thanks.
Yeah, all right. I think this referendum should never have happened, Nigel, to be honest with you.
Uh-huh.
Because, like, look what it's causing. It's causing unrest and everything. You know, it should never have happened. I voted to remain.
Right.
Because I didn't really want a referendum in the first place, because it's good the way things were.
Well, Tony, how can it be good? How can it be good the way things were if...
Well, of course, it's going to be better than what the alternative is, Neil.
What, independence and freedom? What's wrong with that, Tony?
Well, it all depends whose freedom and independence you're talking about, doesn't it? I mean, the independence and freedom of the rich to do what they want, then yeah, fair enough. What about the normal people's freedom, where we can walk where we like and live where we like?
Yeah, what about democracy, Tony? What about democracy? What about ordinary people, whatever their income, whatever their wealth, what about ordinary people actually being in charge of their own destiny as a nation which they're patriotic and proud of?
Well, we are in charge of our own destiny.
Not in the EU, we're not.
Well, of course we are, because the EU keeps you people in check. That's why.
Sorry, you people. I mean, who are you referring to, Tony?
I'm talking to you and the Tory government.
Right. Oh, I see.
Between you and the Tory government.
I see. So we're not fit to run our own country. So these bureaucrats in Brussels keep us in check, yeah?
Yeah, they keep you in check.
Right, okay. No, Tony, you have just made the argument for the European Union, and fine, I don't agree with it, but you've articulated it very, very clearly. Thank you very much for putting that, and there we are, it's a point of view. Morning, Nigel, I agree with the caller. Fran, the last thing the UK needs is a new leader taking over in this situation. I'm a loyal Labour voter, but we voted for Mrs May, and we voted for what is happening, so deal with it. Lee, of course there are people that think that Mrs May should be supported, and had this deal not contained in it the backstop, the trap, the means by which we could perhaps be stuck indefinitely inside European Union rules or see part of our country be annexed, had that not been there, then I don't think, Lee, we'd be having the row that we're having at the moment. But it is a bad deal. It is, I think, the worst deal in history. Andrew from Lancaster is a new caller. Good morning, Andrew.
Morning, Nigel.
So, what would you like to see happen?
What I'd like to see happen, I'd like to see Theresa May, I don't have anything against her personally, but I'd like to see her ideas defeated. I'd like to see Boris Johnson or Rees-Mogg come in, and I'd like to see us fight for our independence and our future.
Okay, and do you think that's likely to happen, Andrew?
I do.
Do you?
But the problem I see is I see either that outcome, or I see a second referendum. I don't want to call it a people's vote. It's not a people's vote. It's a second referendum that the establishment are pushing us towards. But I'd like to see Boris come in, or Rees-Mogg come in and take the fight to Europe, because I know, obviously they're going to say that they're not going to budge. They will budge once they know that they're up against someone who truly wants us to come out of Europe.
If they knew we were serious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think we should be preparing for a second referendum.
Andrew, I can tell you that I am. I don't want another referendum, but I've warned for some time that there was a big campaign that was going to break surface on this, and I wasn't wrong about it. And that's why I'm working, with Longworth and Tyson. Leave means leave. We don't want a referendum, but we're getting ready for one just in case it happens.
Exactly, we have to be ready.
Although I do wonder, Andrew, and here's a thought: if Parliament had a vote on a second referendum, would there be a majority of MPs that would vote for it?
Well, the trouble is with the second referendum, what would the question be?
Of course. If
it were to be go back to full membership of the European Union or to Theresa May's deal, then maybe they would probably look at it. What it needs to be is, a hard Brexit, as they call it, or
a real Brexit, a clean Brexit, Andrew, absolutely, a patriotic Brexit,
the one that we voted for in the first place.
Absolutely.
So it should be either that or go back to the European Union, full membership of the European Union, and then that's going to the country's polarised anyway. But that's the question.
It is of course it is. Do you know, I was at a student conference last week, Andrew, with Vince Cable, and on a personal level, I've always liked Vince Cable. I have done for over 20 years. And when I heard Vince tell the students, the second referendum should be Mrs May's deal against Remain, I mean, I nearly physically wanted to get hold of him because I mean, in many ways, if you feel as I do and as you do, if that was the question, we'd be forced to boycott it. We really would. Andrew,
exactly.
Thank you for your call. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show on LBC, and it's now 11:15. Keep wondering why they can't get the 48 letters, why people like Boris have not been firmer against the Prime Minister. Michael on Facebook says this: all the Brexit cowards do not want to take responsibility for Brexit. They certainly do not want Mrs May's poisoned chalice. It's easy to snipe from the sidelines. Well, Michael, you may have a point, because I don't think they've been bold enough. If they thought Chequers was a total sellout back in July, why on earth is she still there? Why the hell has there not been a contest? Not often I agree with you, Nigel, but I've been waiting for someone to inform the masses about WTO for an age. The government using WTO as a bogeyman is another example of how the establishment wants to mislead us. Conservatives parroting will of the people is a joke. If you wanted to discuss ordinary people, perhaps discuss ordinary people of Northern Ireland who do not want their peace shattered. We need the EU to help support the peace process. Really? Well, the EU had nothing to do with it to begin with, did it? It was the Americans. It was Senator Mitchell, wasn't it, that came as that broker? And indeed, it was something that John Major and Tony Blair had worked on for a very, very long time. It had nothing to do with the European Union. Andrew in Chelmsford is a new caller. Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning, Nigel.
So, let's say you and I were to speak next Sunday, Sunday at about the same time, what would you like to think had happened in those intervening 7 days?
Like, probably the masses. I don't even know anymore, Nigel. I actually do. And I spent a lot of time following everything.
Yep.
I genuinely do not know, because clearly there is not a route, there's not a pathway that unifies the majority of the people. There are too many conflicting ideas. But my idea is this: listening to all the politics of this, both sides of the channel, it is all, as we know, it's all about the backstop. The withdrawal agreement, there is no withdrawal agreement without the backstop. The European Union can call it their insurance policy.
Yep.
Simply, why don't we put a time frame on the backstop rather than it being going on in perpetuity? So put a time limit on it. So even if it's a decade, even if it's a 10-year backstop, but at which point on the anniversary of that 10th year, we can unilaterally leave if there is no deal. Everybody's saying nobody wants a backstop. Everybody's in a worse situation during the backstop.
But who wants to wait 10 years, Andrew?
But again, it's better 10 years than no years.
All right.
5 years.
Andrew, do you think...
Okay, my view is that...
I mean, listen,
you're in the backstop. Everybody will be motivated.
You are right about one. You are right about one thing. That the only chance she's got of getting this deal through Parliament is to come back on Friday from Brussels with a substantial renegotiation of the backstop. You're absolutely right about that.
Exactly. Just put a time. No one would ever buy an insurance policy that went on forever. There has to, anybody who's by entering any agreement, there has to be an exit mechanism.
Okay, so if there is a sunset clause...
that goes on forever, I would never enter a policy that went on forever.
No, absolutely. So if she gets a sunset clause, do you think then Parliament might just accept it?
20 years. It doesn't matter. Just put a number to it. So we know that we can get out if we choose to after a period of time.
But Andrew, if I'm a leaver, right, if I'm somebody that wanted to leave because I see the benefits of making our own laws, I want us to be more competitive than we've been, the thought of another 10 or 20 years fills me with horror.
Yes, okay. But, okay, so as I understand, again, the consensus is that the elements within the withdrawal agreement are pretty much, it covers lots of bases. It's not the perfect solution, but it's probably as best as you're going to get, bar the backstop. Okay. Now, from a hard Brexit, I'm not hard Brexit, but a hard Brexit may look at that and say, you know what? At least we can get out.
Okay.
We may have to wait another 5 years. We may have to wait another 10 years. But at least there is a mechanism.
Andrew,
at the moment, there's no mechanism.
It's a great point. And and who knows where we'll be in a week's time, but one of the things we may well be discussing next week is, has she got enough concessions on the backstop? Andrew, thank you. Up to Rugby to speak to Ian, a new caller. Good morning, Ian.
Good morning, Nigel. Nice to speak to you.
Good to speak to you. So, what do you want to see?
Right, but I think the whole thing started from a bad place. We won the vote in 2016, and basically we got three political parties, none of which wanted to come out of the EU. So we're at a bad starting point from the very beginning. And then as we move on, there's no way Europe was going to give us a good deal. No matter what happens here, I don't think we're going to get a good deal out of them. So, in my opinion, I think we're going to be heading for no deal.
Okay.
Under no deal, they're going to have to sit up and take notice because it's going to affect them in a big way as well. So that's the way I see it going. I mean, who?
And are you, Ian? Can I ask you? Are you fearful of no deal?
No, I'm not. I mean, sometimes in life, the things that are worth doing are dangerous, and I think this is just one of those times. I mean, history will tell you that you go back to the peasants' revolt, if you like. Sometimes you got to take a bit of a slugging, and this is something where we're going to have to stand up and on our own 2 feet and get on with this, because at the moment this whole thing's an absolute shambles. It's an absolute mess.
Yeah, it is, and I have to say, Ian, all this scare stuff about food and we could be starving and Dover and the M20 being a lorry park. And do you know, actually, by volume of goods, Dover only takes 6% of what comes into this country. 6%. So we really are getting ourselves very, very exercised. And one of the reasons, Ian, I had the guy in at Shankar Singham to talk about WTO is to explain how it works with China and everybody else. So we shouldn't be that fearful, really, should we?
No, I mean, how the hell did this country ever, stand on its feet before the EU? I mean,
we must have had good bureaucrats, Ian. Says he tongue-in-cheek. Ian, thank you. I'm going to move down to Barnet, speak to Jim, a new caller. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Nigel. Can you hear me?
I certainly can. Good morning. So what's to happen, Jim?
Well, Nigel, the thing... Thanks to shows like yours, we've got more information than ever before about what the European Union is, what the World Trade Organization is, our position is. Now, with that in mind, is it really that harmful for us to have another vote on what we want to do now that we have the terms in front of us?
And what would the vote be, Jim? I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, that's a complicated question. But one option could be we leave on Theresa May's deal, we leave under World Trade Organization rules, or now that we've seen the full picture, we decide to stay.
But that sounds like a multiple choice, Jim.
I know it's difficult. I never said that I had the exact question in front of me.
No.
Okay.
That
option exists. That option exists.
I think Jim, just 3 points perhaps quickly on this. Number one, we've had a referendum, and to have another one before we've even actually put the first one into being, I think would be democratically a monstrosity. Number two, there is no great public demand for a second referendum. There really isn't. And number three, I'm not sure, Jim, that I'm not sure that Parliament would even vote for it. I'm not sure there's a majority of MPs would vote for this because they would fear a backlash against them in their own constituencies.
Possibly, but as you, I'm no student of politics, but we all know that democracy, the way it has checks and balances in it. We have Parliament, we have ministers, so it's not necessarily. We've had in the past we've had early general elections. We've had, in other parts of the world, we've had presidents resign. So things do change, and I'm not saying that it might even go the same way. And you might, I hear you saying that we should leave under with no deal, or as you call it, a patriotic Brexit, which I don't think is the right language to use, because it's kind of saying it's patriots versus cowards or fearmongers versus lies. We don't need to have that kind of narrative. Everybody wants what's best for the country.
I want us to stand on our own 2 feet, Jim. I want us to be. I mean, that aside, Jim, I've got a fourth problem with your proposition.
Sure.
And that's this. Okay, we have a second referendum, right? And the result is 52-48 leave. Do you think our political class in Westminster would accept it then, or would they carry on frustrating us the way they have in the last couple of years?
You mean, but using my formula, would that be leave under the WTO rules or leave under Theresa May's deal?
Well, Theresa May's deal isn't leaving, really, is it? But leave under WTO rules. I think, Jim, they would still. I think they would still ignore us, and this is what is so frustrating. This, Jim, is why 48% of those people in that opinion poll today in the Sunday Times think politics is broken because they're just not listening to us.
Perhaps. I mean, we can't tell what the future holds. But what we can do is, now that we at the time voted, we didn't have the sort of education on what's going on as we do now. Look at the level of the conversation now compared to June 2016. The level of the conversation has increased so much. We know about the nuances of what everything is. Maybe people didn't even know what a WTO rule deal would be. Now look where the conversation is. Isn't it better for our future to have the question Jim, now rather than then?
But Jim, aren't a lot of people getting rather bored with all this? Don't they just want a conclusion? Don't they just want it over with?
Right, but we would rather have a conclusion that's good for our future. And what I'm saying is, we know more now than ever before. Now is the right now could be the right time for us.
Right,
I understand it would leave some people upset and other people happy, but thinking about our future, we now have more information than ever before. We're very well informed. You've played a role in that. So have other people. So has the mainstream media. We've all contributed to getting us here. Now could be the time to say, look, now we have the options. We leave under World Trade Organization rules. We leave under the government's deal, as bad as it might be, or we actually sit back. There might be Brexiteers out there who've heard things in the last year that say, actually, you know what? My reasons for leaving aren't necessarily
and equally, Jim, a lot of Remainers who see the arrogance of Brussels. And hey, Jim, you've made the point for a second referendum. We've had a good chat about it. I thank you very much indeed for that. And in a moment, going to discuss the fact that in Marrakesh over the next 2 days, the United Nations have a summit, and they're trying to put together a global compact on migration. We'll discuss what's in it. It must be important because 100,000 people online have signed up and want Parliament to have a debate about this. And several countries now, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, are saying they will not sign up to it, yet the British government appears to want to. So we'll discuss that in a moment. But for now, this is the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:30 and time for the news with Philip Chrysakos. I know that Brexit's dominating everything, but we have not had really any debate in this country about what's going on in Marrakesh over the course of the next couple of days. It is the United Nations who have got a big summit there, and they're encouraging countries to sign up to a compact on migration. And there are some people really alarmed at what this may be. And this includes a member of the European Parliament, Marcel de Graaf. And this is what he had to say about it.
On the 10th and 11th of December, there will be an international congress in Marrakesh, Morocco, with regard to this global compact on migration. And the participating countries are set to sign this agreement. And although this joint agreement isn't binding, it's still meant to be the legal framework on which the participating countries commit themselves to build new legislation. And one basic element of this new agreement is the extension of the definition of hate speech. The agreement wants to criminalize migration speech. Criticism of migration will become a criminal offense. And media outlets, and that also concerns you, that give room to criticism of migration can be shut down. The Compact for Migration is legalization of mass migration. It's declaring migration as a human right. So in fact, it will become impossible to criticize Ms. Merkel's welcome migrants politics without being at risk to be jailed for hate speech.
Well, that's pretty strong stuff against. And equally, the Italians think this matters so much, they're going to have a full debate in their parliament in Rome. The Australians, the Americans, the Israelis, the Hungarians, the Slovakians, many have said they are not signing up to this global compact. Yet, from the British government, Alistair Burt, the minister, and we tried to get him on this morning, but he wasn't available. But his statement says the UK government is supportive of the UN's global compact for safe, orderly and regular migration, both as a step forward in international cooperation to tackle irregular migration and as a framework to help us deliver our commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. The final text, he says, clearly supports the Prime Minister's main objectives as set out in her speech to the United Nations. So the Brits are all for this. It would appear most countries in the world are going to sign up to it, but in some places it provoked a big debate. And even though there's not been a lot talked about it here, 100,000 signatures were gained pretty quickly asking for Parliament to have a debate on this. Well, let's try and find a way through the middle of this. I'm going to speak to Professor Brad Blitz, who is author of Migration and Freedom, Professor of International Politics at Middlesex University and Director of the British Academy Programme on Modern Slavery. Brad, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nigel.
So, some very strong views that we're hearing from parts of the continent, but the British government thinking it's all fine. What do you make of this?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what Marcel de Graaf actually said. I mean, this is complete nonsense. I wonder whether or not one can be jailed for spouting nonsense in that context.
Oh, no, otherwise the prisons would be absolutely full, wouldn't they?
Well, exactly, exactly. Now, first of all, there's a complete misunderstanding as to what this compact is about. And secondly, there's further misunderstanding about in as far as where it would take us. Right? This is a non-binding agreement which is being signed among a number of countries that have been working on this text for a considerable period of time. The fundamentals of this are about, it is aspirational. It's about collecting data on migration. It's about trying to minimize the harm that pushes people out. It's about addressing issues around the ethical recruitment of labor, so to prevent modern slavery. Again, a central pillar of what the UK government is about right now. Searching for missing migrants, protecting lives, combating trafficking, promoting inclusion, dignified and safe return. That is really what this is about. It's about arriving at a collaborative approach to migration, addressing it at a global level, but around issues that pertain to all of these states.
Controversially, though, Brad, they do want to make migration a universal human right. Can you not see why that is quite provocative?
Wait a minute. First of all, we're talking about migration.
Yeah.
And it's not immigration. Everyone has the right to come here. Okay, that is a misunderstanding. It is about the treatment of migrants, and it is also about the right to leave your country of origin, which in fact is a human right. But not everyone has the right to enter any country of their choosing. So there's quite a bit of confusion here. But to suggest that if you talk about migration, you'll be violating, you'll be subject to violating hate speech is like saying we can't criticize health policy or education policy. It is a nonsense.
Well, there is. I mean, what I thought was very interesting and very surprising. And I understand that it's non-binding, but it's meant to be a sort of moral commitment if you've signed up to it. But what I found really surprising in the text was the section on media. when it described media organisations who they described as being racist and xenophobic because they oppose mass migration. And they're encouraging governments to provide material support to media organisations that support migration and actually to start to demonise those that don't. And I found that, Professor Blitz, quite disturbing.
No, what this is actually about is addressing hate speech where and how it occurs. And it's not just coming out and saying, we believe that mass migration is problematic and it needs to be addressed through A, B, and C. There's a gross oversimplification around what Marcel de Graaf has actually said.
But why put it in the report at all? Why would a UN report actually encourage governments to interfere in media? I mean, this is not online, this is media coverage of these issues.
Well, we know that the way in which people are described affects the way in which they're treated. And we know that inflammatory language does lead to hate crimes, it does lead in some cases to violent deaths, and it also discourages efforts to rescue and save people and protect and promote their rights. So there is a link. But ultimately, this agreement is about protecting rights in a sensible way, and in a way which is ultimately shared by many states that have similar policies addressing these issues.
Are you surprised by the level of debate that is taking place in America, the level of debate that will take place in the Italian Parliament, and the fact that as tomorrow approaches, country after country, Austria, Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Switzerland, I mean, the number of countries that are withdrawing from this is quite remarkable.
Yes, and there may be reasons why they're withdrawing from it, but equally, these are not countries that have actually taken in migrants. These are countries that have not only resisted and refused to participate in EU and other efforts that came on the back of the European refugee and migration crisis of the last few years, which peaked just a few years ago. But these are states that are also playing to populist audiences. These are populist politicians as well that are trying to get quick votes on the cheap. And they note that the fear of migration is a vote winner, but also they don't want to be seen as being soft on migration because people don't understand what this global compact is about. They don't understand what it means to have a non-binding international agreement coming through the UN. And ultimately, they are playing on these fears because it addresses their political base and it buys them more support.
So if I'm living in a country that has signed up to this compact, and I am opposed.
And you will be.
I will be. Yes, I know. And who knows? They might change their mind. But and I am opposed to mass migration from a different culture. I mean, post this compact, aren't I getting really much closer to committing hate speech than I was before?
I don't see that. Are you actively coming out and calling for violent attacks against migrants?
No, of course not. No, of course not. Of course not.
Are you encouraging others to do so?
No, of course not.
Right. So I don't see why we can't have a debate on migration. I don't see why we can't raise this issue without this becoming hate speech, and that this can be, a perfectly sensible debate. And if you look at the commitments that are included in this, they're very sensible. They're about gathering evidence, which is the sort of thing that as a professor, as a researcher, I try to gather. It's about addressing the harms that propel people to migrate well before they reach the border, well before they reach the Mediterranean even. It's about looking at this in a much more coherent and addressing the complexities.
Well, I tell you what, the one thing we have done this morning, Professor Blitz, is we had a proper civilised debate about this, and it's an issue that's being talked about around the world and too little in this country. And thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Well, as I say, that's a big debate. It's happening all over Europe, and you heard two very clear sides of the argument there. Look at it. It's coming up in the next 2 days. Russell in Woking's been hanging on the line. He's a new caller, and he wants to give me his view on the Brexit vote on Tuesday. Good morning, Russell.
Good morning, Nigel. First, I think it's going to fail by over 100. I think that we should go for no deal, but it won't happen. Mm-hmm. PM should stand down, along with Hammond, because basically he cannot be any way seen as being credible for a Brexit approach.
What about Rudd?
No, I originally voted for Remain, Nigel, incidentally. Yeah. And I live a half a mile from Theresa May's house.
Right.
So basically, I'm in her constituency. So my views have changed dramatically over the last 18 months by the way we've been treated by Europe. But I just cannot see anything happening other than a second vote, which I disagree with, but they are not going to approve it with 75% of the House.
Well, maybe
Remain.
Maybe, Russell, it comes down to, maybe it comes in the end down to leaving on WTO terms or a second vote. But those MPs from Leave constituencies that vote to make their people have another referendum, they're risking their careers, aren't they?
They are, but I still think that there's too many people like Grieve in Beaconsfield who are going to basically pilot it that it won't happen. Now, I agree with you. I think WTO is not a disaster by any means, and withholding some of the 39 billion back, if not all, is obviously the first stage of actually balancing off the cost of dealing with only 6% of our imports coming through Dover and other fallacies of drugs, etc. But obviously the fear factor has been built into the population. Because the population are not, I'm probably one of these saddos that actually is fairly clued up on most aspects of it, from the economy right through of Europe. But most people are bobs, as they call them. So subsequently. Now, I got a question for you.
Quickly.
I have a question for you. On Politics Live, on Friday, they were talking about a new campaign in preparation, cross-party and other people. Have you been approached as part of that campaign if it goes to a second vote?
Yeah, there's lots of cooperation. I'm afraid the first Brexit campaign had too much division between two different camps. There's a lot more cooperation this time. Russell, I thank you very much indeed. Ian in the New Forest says, they always say it's non-binding before it becomes law. This is the establishment attempting to make just criticising migration a criminal offence. Well, it's certainly, I think, a step in that direction. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:45. 5 weekends ago, President Macron was there at the 100th anniversary of the armistice, looking like a global leader, very self-confident, giving many of us advice about the future and what nationalism meant. Now, we've had 4 consecutive weekends of protests in Paris. To analyse some of this, joining me is Bénédicte Pavillot, UK correspondent for France 24. Good morning, Bénédicte.
Good morning, Nigel.
Would it be fair to say that yesterday in Paris was not quite as violent as the previous week?
It was not the worrying scenes and really very sad scenes we saw the weekend before in Paris. The policing tactics were very different. The number of police was incredibly impressive, 85,000 across France, because although Paris was the epicenter of the terribly bad clashes the weekend before, and also less bad clashes yesterday, we had over 1,000 arrests in Paris yesterday, 1,400 all over France.
I saw on, was it Thursday, there were tax offices out in some of the departments being petrol bombed. I mean, we get the impression on UK media that it's just Paris, but it isn't, is it?
No, that's right. And you're right, there were incidents. I mean, there have been incidents in schools as well. In fact, some journalists were attacked with acid also on Saturday, on Friday, sorry. And that was very, very worrying development, where the media is also being targeted. But you're right, it's not just in Paris. We had terrible scenes yesterday in a very well-known city that's very well known by the British, amongst others, Bordeaux, where there were really worrying, destructive scenes there. But there have been also protests in Lyon, for example, in Toulouse. So it has been widespread across France.
Now, in French history, perhaps 1968 was the last time this happened on such a huge scale, with the student Danny Cohn-Bendit.
Indeed.
Yeah, who I knew very well in the European Parliament, of course. And it did lead to General de Gaulle effectively losing the presidency of France. How much trouble? I mean, Macron's got a majority in the Assemblée Nationale, but his own personal poll rating is down to 18%. Is he in trouble or not?
Oh, he's definitely in trouble. There's no doubt about that. presidents are now elected for 5 years. It used to be 7 years. So he was elected in May of last year. So he's got some time to go still. And as you say, he's got a majority in Parliament. But what he's also got is a massive communication problem and really credibility problem at the moment, with a very real anger that is taking a very personal slant towards him. One of the criticisms and labels that has stuck for some time, he's an ex-banker at Rothschild's Bank, is that he's the president of the rich. Of course, this is something that he and his team absolutely dispute. I've watched, interestingly, unearthed by a French journalist today, a president, well, he was not president then, candidate Macron, talking about how he was in listening mode in July 2016 and how the very essence of the En Marche movement, before it became a political party, was really important in listening to people. And when one listens back to that footage, one sees that there is a real problem. And it's being taken, of course, very seriously. So what we saw yesterday is law and order being much more respected, I would say, very much because of the police tactics. Also, I think across the board, political leaders have tried to call for calm. And one has to separate the genuine Gilets jaunes protesters, or certainly pacific ones, who are protesting and have every right in a democracy to protest and make their anger, displeasure, demands known, and a small minority, but a very vocal one, that are what is called in French les casseurs, the breakers, the destroyers, and who are causing this, as everybody will understand.
And of course, you've mentioned
3 weeks before Christmas, terrible damage.
Yeah, and shops closed and bad for tourism.
Shut it up, absolutely. Let alone the world headlines and tourism affected. Of course,
yeah, and Benedict, you've twice mentioned policing tactics. Very interesting. I wonder whether this has been picked up in the French media or not. But the Euro Gendarmerie Force were on the streets of Paris yesterday. Portugal is currently president of this sort of European, almost paramilitary type of police force. And there they were on the streets of Paris yesterday with Portuguese flags on their helmets. Has this been commented on by the protesters?
Well, I saw some, I can't comment about that, because what I saw is some fake news with some police, huge almost tanks, if you will, with EU thing, and that was disproved as being actually photoshopped. So,
you don't believe it? Okay.
Well, I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on it.
Okay, no, well, I've seen reports of it.
Not my type of journalism.
No, fine. Benedict Pavier, thank you. That was Benedict, UK correspondent for France 24, and we will find more about that, whether it's true or not. Back to Brexit, and I'm going to speak to Jennifer, who is in Ealing. Jennifer, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
Huge week coming up, Jennifer. When I sit in this chair next Sunday, what will have happened in your view?
Well, definitely I think there'll be... they'll vote it all down. And from my point of view, I feel that Theresa May has got more allegiance to the EU than she has to the people of this country. And it doesn't have to be like this, because I listened to Boris Johnson, Esther McVey and Dominic Raab this morning, and they all had very sensible arguments as to why she could go back and still get us a deal. But the trouble is, I think, if you like, it's not a very, probably, a good thing to say, but I think this had been her master plan all along.
Oh.
Because she never, ever has put anything in place to plan for a no deal, and actually a no deal would actually bring a very quick deal, because the EU would not want their ships in the North Sea loaded with cars. I mean, we've only had a one-way argument.
No, it works both ways.
No,
it does, Jennifer. I mean, Jennifer, was her ambition from the start just to get us to leave the European Union in name, and that's all she ever really wanted?
Well, she's a Remainer, isn't she? And she may have a lot of stamina, but she hasn't actually got many negotiating skills. and the trouble is, who would go forward offering someone a pot of gold before they even started talking about...
Well, I mean, none of us would do it, Jennifer, would we?
And also, she hasn't told us what this 39 billion is that we're paying for. What we're giving it to them.
Well, most of it, Jennifer, is effectively continuing to pay the membership fee.
Yeah, that's right, for the next 5 years at least. But the other thing is, why haven't we had any positives from her or the Remainers that support her about how this country could look away from the EU? All we've ever had is arguments of how we're going to go down the tube.
Jennifer, they don't believe in it. Thank you.
I know they don't. And this is, and I say, when I feel that her allegiance is to the whole of the EU rather than to me.
No, you may be right. Jennifer. I'm going to let you go. I've got time. You've got 30 seconds, David in Sheffield. New caller. Hi. Sorry, it's not long.
Well, I hope that we get David Davis to take over. I think he would...
as a caretaker?
More people. Yes, as a caretaker. Possibly longer term. But that's the future.
And do you feel, David, I mean, do you think Mrs May's done her best or not?
She's possibly done her best, but it doesn't follow the vote. So I think to sort it out properly, we should move away on WTO and then negotiate with the EU.
And they can't...
a proper deal.
And David, they come running after us. I'm sorry that time was so short. Well, David there, summing up the way I feel, the way many of us feel. The vote is not being honoured by our political class. A week of big drama to come. Will Theresa May still be here this time next week? But you know what? We've asked that before. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'll be back tomorrow evening at 6. At 3 this afternoon, it's Ian Payne. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel. Coming up, footballer Raheem Sterling has said that newspapers are helping to fuel racism by the way in which they portray young black footballers. This comes after he appears to have received racist abuse from fans during a game. Do newspapers need to be more careful about fueling racism? Before that, senior Church in England bishops are to begin an inquiry into gay cure therapy amid claims that it's still prevalent among religious groups despite a promised government ban. Should gay conversion therapy be banned? But first, Theresa May will seek to emulate Margaret Thatcher by travelling to Brussels to demand a better Brexit deal. Can the Prime Minister save herself and her government from further humiliation before this Tuesday's vote?
On your radio, on your phone.
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 12 o'clock, Theresa May is telling her rebel Conservative MPs they risk a Jeremy Corbyn Labour government unless they vote through her Brexit agreement on Tuesday. The Prime Minister adds if they don't, there will be a very real risk of the United Kingdom not leaving the European Union. But former Brexit Secretary Dominic Raab believes the UK can still get a better deal.
I'm not suggesting